When you work as a software engineer in a big tech company, you're bound to encounter brilliant, ambitious people. Heck, maybe you're one of those brilliant, ambitious people. A natural question that arises is it worth me going to a startup? In today's video, we're going to talk about that. Hi, I'm John Miller, the Deliberate Engineer. I spent the last 30 years working as a software engineer, software manager, architect, and so on at a bunch of different companies, including Microsoft, Google, Amazon, Oracle, CMU, both as part of the School of Computer Science staff and as a member of a research project. I was also in Microsoft Research for about 6 years, working as a software engineer who was helping to take late-stage research and help spin it out into startups or to move it into product teams or to have it be the basis of its own product. Finally, my last job before I took this sabbatical was actually working at a startup, ThoughtSpot. In addition to my direct experience, many of my friends and colleagues have spent time at startups, going anywhere from being a founding member of a new startup to joining startups with hundreds of people working at them that are on the cusp of their own IPO or acquisition. Despite being a relatively young industry, only 40 or 50 years old in any meaningful size, the software industry is one that still produced many household names and propelled some of the people who founded them into celebrity and being multi-billionaires. Examples include Microsoft, Amazon, Google, Facebook, and any number of other companies. In addition to these well-known startups, there's also a host of less well-known but still very impressive startups out there. It's very natural to take a look at these positive examples and think, wow, I'm really missing out by not making a startup. The problem is that just like being a writer and many other things in life, you tend to get exposed to the really exceptional success cases and not to see the 99% that failed. So let's get one thing out of the way right away. In terms of compensation, a startup generally won't pay you as well as working in big tech. You may see these people become billionaires, but the vast majority of people who work at startups wind up making less money than they would have made if they'd just gone to a big tech company and having a less stable career. The vast majority of the startups do fail. The failure doesn't always mean that they go out of business with a catastrophic bankruptcy. Sometimes it can just mean that they've treaded water for so long that they lose their way and they realize they're not going to achieve their ambitions, and so they call it quits and let the company peter out or dissolve it. In those cases, the employees generally wind up making significantly less than they would have if they'd managed to get into big tech. Even in the successful cases where the company ends with either an acquisition by a bigger company or going public itself, most of the people who work at that company will still wind up making less money than they would have if they'd gone to big tech. Even the people who are early founders or nearly founders of the companies can wind up not making as much as you might think. One friend of mine worked at a startup. He was in the first 6 people hired into the startup, and he was there for 5 years, from their first year up through their acquisition by a large big tech company. When they got acquired, he was given a substantial stock payout by that large tech company and given a vice president role in it. Now, he was well positioned to be able to make lots of money and to have a lot of control and accomplish great things moving forward. But if you just looked at the money that he made from when he started that startup up through when he got his stock to join the company that bought them out, and you added all that up, it didn't wind up being any more than a senior engineer or a low principal engineer would have made at a big tech company. And that's with a really outstanding exit for that startup. So again, that's not to say you can't make a fortune at a startup, but it's incredibly unlikely. Even the success cases are just sort of okay, and there's a lot more failure cases than success cases. So don't have money be the only reason you want to do a startup. I mentioned most of the startups fail, and this has been my experience watching my friends go to startups. The friend who had a successful acquisition, he had a couple failed startups before that. As well, in the early 2000s, I saw a bunch of my colleagues at Microsoft heading out for greener pastures, either making their own startup or joining with a couple friends as a near founder in a new startup. Virtually all of those friends wound up coming back to Microsoft or going someplace else after their startup failed. I don't think any of them lasted more than 4 years. Of course, there's a lot more to working at a startup than just trying to make a pile of cash. It's about having more control over the work that you do, getting to have a wider scope of influence, getting to do the sorts of things you would never get to do as a software engineer in big tech. For example, helping out with marketing or product definition, meeting with customers, all kinds of things. As well, you can wind up having job titles that wouldn't be accessible to you in big tech. You might join the C-suite of the company or become a vice president. It doesn't necessarily mean the same thing that it would at a larger company, but it can still be a bit of a rush to have this job title that says, I'm important to this company. Another advantage to working at a startup, especially one where things are going relatively well, is the companies tend to grow quickly, and growth always brings opportunities with it. That means your career can move forward in leaps and bounds far faster than it could at a big tech company. So that's another advantage. There's a flip side to that coin, however. That is that the opportunities that come with the growth are because there's a very real need for people to be doing more than just a single silo's worth of activity. If some people have to be let go or if some people depart, other people have to cover what they're doing. And there may not be enough people in that exact discipline to get the job done. So as a software engineer, you might find yourself setting up servers or setting up DNS or doing all kinds of different maintenance, meeting with customers, doing sales, anything that needs to get done. That is the flip side of all the opportunity there is at the startup. Work has to get done to keep the company afloat and to have things sell. I have an example of this from my own background. In the mid-90s, Lycos was one of the first big web search companies. Before they made it big, they actually came out of Carnegie Mellon University, the place that I was working at the time. And I had a chance to talk to them and think about interviewing there. I was a software engineer at the time, and I loved solving problems, writing code, doing this sort of thing. As I talked to the folks at Lycos, they're like, oh yeah, we have just tons of problems to solve. But we also have a lot of other things that need to get done. Somebody has to take care of troubleshooting problems with the racks, putting new machines in, getting them set up, doing the wiring, troubleshooting issues that happen, come in days, nights, weekends, whenever there's a problem. We have to fix that. And it may not involve any coding at all. For me, this was a big red flag because at that point in my career, I wasn't ready to do that sort of let's do anything. I wanted to code, I wanted to solve problems, and this didn't sound like it was going to be an opportunity for me to do that full time. So I wound up not interviewing, and this will later turn into a story about how I missed out on millions of dollars the second time in my career. It just goes to show you really do wind up having to do whatever it takes to keep the lights on and keep the product selling when you're at a startup. My last job before I took this sabbatical was working at a startup called ThoughtSpot. It's a company that has 500 or 600 people, and it has a different take on analytics for data sets. In joining ThoughtSpot, there were a lot of great things about the company. But one thing that became clear as I was working there is it still had a bit of this, you have to do whatever it takes to keep the company afloat. So I was expecting to work more in one silo, but there were lots of other areas that needed people to pitch in and contribute. And I found that I wasn't able to make the sort of progress I wanted in my own silo while doing these other things. I was putting in 50 or 55 hours a week, which I thought was pretty decent. But the fact was, in order to get the sort of results that they expected and they wanted, it would have had to be more like 80 hours a week. As a result, I wound up leaving the company. Well, there's a lot of sort of anecdotal evidence and stories about working in startups and how it compares to working in big tech or other types of jobs. Let's take a look at a startup versus big tech or other types of jobs in 4 different dimensions. This includes the career trajectory and how quickly you can advance, compensation, the infrastructure that you have to get your job done, and then finally the stability that goes with the company. Compensation. These days startups are paying much closer to market wages, so you don't necessarily have to take a pay cut to go work at a startup. They can also, if they're a larger startup, have quite good benefits competitive with the existing big tech companies. For example, ThoughtSpot absolutely did. Other startups may not. It's really going to depend, but in general you don't have to take quite as much of a pay cut to work at a startup as you would have in the past. Flipping that around, we've already talked about how there's not likely going to be a huge payout for joining a startup, even if they go IPO, which very few do, even if they stick around and get acquired, which very few do. So you should bear this in mind as you're making your decision. If compensation is your primary motivation, you're probably going to be disappointed. Infrastructure tends to be not as mature at a startup as it is at big tech. Big tech companies have invested lots of money hiring people and setting up things so that you have a nice place to work, the equipment you need, repairs and help desks to help you fix problems with it. They have people who are dedicated to the development tools that you require to do your job. making sure they do what they're supposed to, making sure the servers are always running, they always have enough storage on them and enough cycles to do things. Sometimes even test teams that can help verify end-to-end that your product is working. At a startup, you're always battling against the fact that the startup is growing. So the choices you make for the company when you are at 10 or 20 people are going to be very different than the choices you might have made at 100 or 500 people. As a result, you wind up having to evolve the systems and live with a lot of sort of issues with the infrastructure you're using, whether that's the office space you have or the type of machines you have access to, or the build environment or maintenance or help desk, any of that stuff. It's all going to be harder at a startup than it is at a big tech company. Overall stability would be much better at a big tech company than it will be at a startup. Even if the startup doesn't have any financial issues, they're not having to let people go, lay people off, there'll still be other types of work that you'll have to pitch in with. You'll have to go above and beyond sometimes. You'll have to work in areas that aren't interesting to you and aren't necessarily places where you feel like you add a lot of value, and it keeps you from getting the primary job that you came to do done. There's a certain set of things that have to be done to create a product, to support that product, and to get it in the hands of customers. And it's your job as a member of the startup to make sure those things happen. Career trajectory is much better if you're working at a startup because the company's growing and growth always comes with opportunities. There's only so many people that can be assimilated from outside, which means when they need the next manager at the next level up, or the next vice president, or the next person to head this division, you are going to be a candidate for that, and you're more likely to get a job at a startup more quickly than you would at a big tech company or any other large company. So, is a startup the right place for you to work? Ultimately, that's a question you'll have to answer yourself. I've done what I can to give you a kind of comparison between the sorts of places I'm used to working, large corporations, and the environment that I encountered at startups, both directly and through my friends. You get a lot of advantages working at a startup in terms of flexibility, freedom, being able to do things, but you have to work harder. You'll have to do it in a more challenging environment, and if you're expecting some sort of a big payout, that's probably not going to be there. You're probably better off sticking with a more established company and industry if that's your primary motivation. Thanks for making it this far in the video. For this video in particular, I'm very interested to hear what people's experiences are with startups. Am I painting too dark a picture, or is it in line with your experience? Do you have other advice you'd like to share with people who are thinking about going to a startup, or people who are freshly graduated who are trying to decide between an offer from a startup and an offer from a big tech or just a large company? Please put comments down below. I'd love to see what you think. Thanks again for making it to the end of the video, and keep on pushing forward. Hi, this is John. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please think about subscribing so you get notified of my future videos. Also, if you are interested, you might want to check out the video I have linked here. Thanks, and keep on pushing forward.